Tonight, we explore the strangest corners of history where power and prestige collided with the most undignified endings imaginable. Kings and queens, emperors and popes, all of them masters of the known world, yet somehow unable to master their own final moments. Some died in battle, others in bed. But tonight we focus on those whose exits were so bizarre, so unexpectedly ridiculous that history has never quite known what to do with them. From desert-induced demise to bathroom betrayals, these stories remind us that no crown, no throne, and no amount of gold-plated ceremony can protect you from the universe's sense of humor. So before we begin, I want to invite you to join this journey properly. If you enjoy history told with a wink and a sense of wonder, hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. It genuinely helps this channel grow and allows us to keep digging up the strangest stories the past has to offer. Now settle and dim the lights and prepare to discover how some of history's most powerful figures met their most embarrassing ends. Because when it comes to royal deaths, the truth is often the calm historian. King Adolf Frederick of Sweden. A man who wore a crown, commanded a kingdom, and yet met his end not in battle, not in betrayal, but at the dinner table. It was February 1771, a chilly European evening, and the king, like many of us after a long day, decided to treat himself. But his idea of a treat was nothing short of a culinary suicide mission. The royal menu that night was ambitious, to say the least. Lobster, caviar, sauerkraut, smoked herring, and champagne. Not one glass, but several. Enough to make even the most steadfast constitution begin to waver. But none of that was his undoing. What truly sealed his fate was dessert. Specifically a Swedish pastry called semla. A sweet roll made of wheat and cardamom filled with almond paste, and topped with mountains of whipped cream, served floating in a bowl of warm milk. It is delicious. It is rich. It is the kind of dessert you eat one of and feel perfectly satisfied. King Adolf Frederick had 14. 14. That is not a treat. That is a declaration of war against your own digestive system. One can only imagine the scene. The royal court watching in mounting horror as their monarch reached for pastry after pastry. Somewhere between number 10 and number 13, a servant must have leaned in and whispered something about pacing himself. But the king waved them off, spoon in hand, cream on his lips, determined to go out on his own terms. And he did. Later that evening, he complained of stomach cramps, then pain, then collapse. The official cause of death was recorded as digestive problems, which is a remarkably gentle way of saying the man ate himself into oblivion. He was not assassinated. He was not struck down by plague or war. He was defeated by pastry. And in that strange, absurd way, there is something almost majestic about it. He chose his fate. He embraced it. And he left behind a legacy that no amount of political reform or administrative achievement could ever overshadow. He is remembered as the king who loved dessert a little too much. A cautionary tale for anyone who has ever looked at a second slice of cake and thought, why not? So the next time you reach for that extra helping, just remember King Adolf Frederick and his 14 semlas. And maybe, just maybe, reconsider. Because history is full of powerful men who fell from grace. But few fell quite as deliciously as he did. And that, of course, is only the beginning. Because as strange as his story is, it is far from the most undignified exit in royal history. Some kings died on thrones of a different kind, and others met their end in ways that would make even the most imaginative storyteller blush. So stay with me, because the next tale involves a king, a chamber pot, and a legacy that no amount of royal polish can ever fully erase. And that brings us to a king whose final moments were witnessed by no one but his servants and his own private chamber. King George II of Great Britain. A man who ruled an empire, who commanded armies, and who presided over a golden age of art and science. And yet his name is forever tied to a location no monarch would ever choose for their final act. It was the morning of October 25, 1760. King George, in his late 70s, woke up feeling a bit off. Nothing dramatic. Just the usual aches and grumbles of a man who had lived a long and eventful life. Still, he followed his routine. Some light conversation. A bit of royal muttering. And then, as all men, must a visit to the privy. Except on this morning, he did not return. Moments later, servants rushed in and found the monarch slumped over the chamber pot. He had suffered a sudden aortic aneurysm, a rupture of the body's largest artery, and died instantly. Technically, it was natural causes. But the location, unforgiving. Let us paint the picture. The King of England. the defender of the faith, meeting his end not in a gilded bedchamber, not on a battlefield, but half-sitting mid-business in a moment of complete and utter vulnerability. Hardly the portrait you want hanging over the fireplace. To be fair, the chamber pot itself was no peasant bucket. Porcelain, possibly gold-rimmed, flanked by servants trained in the art of absolute discretion. But still, it is the kind of death that gets whispered about in footnotes, not sung in ballads. The physicians wrote it up respectfully. The public was told he died of a heart problem, which was true enough. But the full story was preserved thanks to court gossip and a few very honest palace attendants who simply could not let it go. And neither has history. Because for all his accomplishments, his wars, his reforms, his reign over an empire, George II is remembered most clearly for one thing. He is the only British monarch to die on the toilet. A legacy no one asked for and no one has matched. He ruled an empire and died like a man in a moment of private vulnerability that history has refused to forget. And as undignified as that sounds, it is still not the strangest death on our list. Because next we travel north to the brutal world of the Vikings, where one warrior met his end at the hands of a man who was already dead. And now we journey north to the windswept shores of the Orkney Islands, where the sea crashes against cliffs and the cold bites like a blade. This is the world of the Vikings, a brutal, unforgiving realm where men earned their names through blood and iron. Among them stood Sigurd the Mighty, a warrior of such fearsome reputation that his very name sent tremors through the Scottish Highlands. He had raided, he had conquered, he had carved his legend into the bones of his enemies. But history remembers him not for his victories, but for a death so absurd, so cosmically ironic that it reads like a dark joke whispered in a mead hall. Sigurd had just defeated his Scottish rival, a chieftain named Maelbrigt. In a display of Viking bravado, he severed the man's head and tied it to his saddle as a trophy. A common practice in those days, brutal, yes, but considered perfectly acceptable. The problem, however, was that Maelbrigt's head still had teeth. As Sigurd rode home in triumph, the head bounced and swayed with the rhythm of the horse. At some point along that bumpy ride, one of the dead man's teeth scraped against Sigurd's leg. A minor cut, a scratch, nothing to worry about if you have access to modern medicine. But this was the 9th century. An infection spread fast. Within days, the mighty warrior who had slain dozens, conquered territories, and terrorized the Northern Isles was dead. Not by an ambush, not by a blade, but by a bite from a man whose mouth was no longer moving. Imagine the scene. His men gathered around their fallen chieftain, staring at the severed head still tied to the saddle. They must have wondered if the gods themselves were laughing. Sigurd's legacy is now a legend not of conquest, but of cosmic slapstick. He is remembered as the only Viking in history who lost his life to a dead man's dental work. And as bizarre as that tale is, it pales in comparison to what happened to a crown prince who was sealed inside a wooden box for 8 agonizing days. And now we turn to the east, where the palace walls of the Joseon dynasty held secrets too dark to speak aloud. Crown Prince Sardo of Korea was born into privilege, groomed for power, and destined for the throne. But he was also a man tormented by demons that no amount of royal comfort could soothe. His behavior grew erratic. Violent outbursts, sudden rages, whispers of madness that echoed through the corridors of power. His father, King Yeonjo, was a Confucian monarch, a man of order and unbearable restraint. He could not execute his own son. That would be politically disastrous and spiritually unthinkable. But leaving him alive was equally dangerous. So the king devised a solution both creative and unspeakably cruel. He had Sardo placed inside a large wooden rice chest. A box designed for grain, not for men. It was mid-July in Korea, and the heat was merciless. There was no ventilation, no water, no hope of reprieve. Sardo survived for 8 agonizing days. 8 days of suffocating darkness, 8 days of desperate pleas that went unanswered. No trial, no blade, just a slow, sealed descent into eternity. The official records cleaned up for posterity stated that Prince Sardo passed away due to divine judgment. But we know the truth. He was rice-boxed to death, a horror sealed in silence. And yet, as we leave this story of filial cruelty, we find ourselves in a very different part of the world where a king met his end not in a box, but in a fit of laughter. A king who proved that even the most absurd jokes can have fatal consequences. And now we travel to the sun-drenched kingdom of Aragon, where the year 1410 brought an end to a reign in the most unexpected way imaginable. King Martin of Aragon was a man of considerable power and political cunning. But in his final days he was plagued by something far less noble: chronic indigestion, the kind of royal flatulence that could clear a court. Confined to his bed and desperate for relief, he summoned his personal jester and demanded a joke. Something light, something to lift his bloated spirits. The jester delivered. The joke is preserved in court accounts went something like this. "Why did you take so long to arrive?" the king asked. The jester replied, "Because I saw a young deer hanging from a fig tree by its tail, and I had to wonder if it was an act of divine punishment. Perhaps it was the timing. Perhaps it was the delirium. Or perhaps the king had simply not laughed in weeks because he was too busy digesting an entire goose." But whatever the reason, Martin burst into hysterical laughter. And he did not stop. Within moments he was gasping, clutching his stomach, and finally collapsing. The official cause of death was listed as indigestion and uncontrollable laughter. A man who had ruled a kingdom brought low by a joke about a deer. His advisors must have struggled to write that report with straight faces. "Your Majesty has passed," while laughing extremely hard. It was a death so undignified, so absurd that it became legend. Proof positive that humor can indeed kill. As we leave Martin to his eternal punchline, we turn to an emperor whose obsession with immortality led him to a fate far more ironic. A man who poisoned himself while searching for eternal life. And now we arrive at the most poetic irony in all of royal history. A man who sought immortality but found only poison. Emperor Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of a unified China, was a force of nature. He standardized currency and writing. He built roads and fortifications. He commissioned the legendary Terracotta Army, an entire battalion of clay soldiers designed to protect him in the afterlife. But here is the dark secret that history almost forgot. Qin Shi Huang had absolutely no intention of dying. He was obsessed with the idea of living forever. And so he tasked his court alchemists with a mission: find the elixir of eternal life. Their solution: mercury pills, tiny shimmering capsules of liquid metal marketed as the key to immortality. The science behind it was non-existent, but the pills had a certain shine, and in ancient China shininess often implied power. The emperor, convinced that he was swallowing life itself, began taking these mercury-based treatments daily. Not occasionally, daily. The result was tragically predictable. His health began to fail. His mind grew clouded. Paranoia gripped his every thought. And on a fateful journey to find more magical ingredients, he collapsed and died, poisoned by the very thing he believed would make him eternal. The irony is almost too perfect. The man who conquered kingdoms was defeated by a shiny pill. His court, in a panic, hid his death for days. During that time, his entourage reportedly traveled with a wagon of rotting fish to mask the smell of his decomposing body. The emperor who feared death so deeply ended up fermenting next to seafood. A cautionary tale about trusting quack science and the desperate pursuit of forever.